Great. So thank you very much for having me here. It's really exciting to be in Italy, as you know, or may know. Italy was one of our first national consortia at ORCID. In fact, we're not really sure between the UK and Italy who, I think one signed first and one did the press release first, but it was in the space of 2 days. So it's really great to be here. And I'll talk a bit about what ORCID does, how we work with research institutions, but also specifically today focusing on individuals and how you can make use of ORCID and how you can benefit from this. Briefly, as you can see, my title is Director of Membership, and really what my team does is works with institutions to see how you can integrate with ORCID and then transfer those benefits to individuals. So we'll do a bit of, I guess, basis of what ORCID does and how ORCID operates, and then I'll go into some details about the individual, and then circle back to some work that we're doing with funding organizations at the moment. Let me see. So I always like to start the presentations with a bit of context why identifiers exist, why we use persistent identifiers. And I like to look at it first from the individual perspective. So individuals have multiple profile systems. So if we name a few, Google Scholar Profile, Research IDs, Author Profiles, ResearchGates, Academia.edu. And all of these profile systems are challenging for the individual to manage because there's all these different things. And a common question that I get is, well, ORCID is just another one of these, and which is a challenge, you know. And ORCID is not here to replace any of those systems, is what I can say. Is what we really are trying to do is connect these systems together so we can enable interoperability across systems. And I'll talk a bit about the difference between a persistent identifier and a profile system in a moment. We also have, as individuals, manual data entries. So increasingly, we have to put information into different systems. When we submit a manuscript, when we apply for funding, when we work at an institution, the institution says, what did you publish this year? And as a researcher, we have to enter all of this information. So ORCID is there to reduce that administrative burden and allow for synchronization of information. We also have a big challenge around control over personal data. So as individuals, how do we know which systems and who has access to our metadata? And particularly if we look in context of GDPR, and so tomorrow's the big day for GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and that's very important to ORCID. In fact, we've spent the last week, if you've got an ORCID ID, you may have received an email. I think last night we had sent out 3 million emails, so we're at 1.8 million to go. But if you were in those 3 million, you would have got an email about GDPR and what we do with GDPR. So very important as an individual, how do you control your personal data, who accesses that, and how can they view that metadata? And then also importantly, we have a challenge around name ambiguity, and I'll show you an example using myself, but common names, shared names, different naming conventions in different formats creates a challenge for us as individuals to receive the recognition and credit for the work that we do. And also importantly, the recognition and credit shouldn't only be for publications. It could be conference proceedings, it could be patents, it could be an invention. Any type of work that we do as an individual. The challenges for organizations is the same thing, name ambiguity, so searching for an individual's name, searching for an organization's name can be listed in very different formats. How do we trust the metadata? So as an organization, do we know that the information is reliable, that there's no errors in the metadata? We have reporting meaning that often we only report back at the end of the year or at the end of the quarter. So how do we track this near real time? As soon as a publication is published, we should be able to synchronize that with an institutional system. We have silo systems, so systems that don't create communication or feed information between them, so that's a challenge. And then also as an organization, they want to measure return on investment. They're investing in research, and how do we make sure that we can track the return on investment, not from a financial point of view, but measure the impact of the research, the social impact of that research, and also ensuring the discoverability of that research and professional activity of individuals. So why is there a problem? So prior to ORCID, the research community lacked the ability to link researchers and scholars, so include scholars here. I looked yesterday, there were over 130,000 individuals in Italy that have ORCID IDs. As far as I know, in the academic faculty, that's around 70,000, if I'm correct, researchers in Italy. Faculty? Yeah. How many? Yeah. Yeah. And there's,
I don't know, up to now we are about 5,000.
Okay. So across the country,
8,000 full-time employees,
okay.
and
5,000.
5,000.
Okay. So
no, I think
yeah,
the
big growth would be around the same.
total number.
Okay. So yeah, and that's what I found quite interesting. Being at 130,000, there's obviously a lot of industry, and also perhaps a lot of scholars using ORCID IDs in Italy. The challenge is to link these individuals with their professional activities, and the challenge exists primarily around name variations. So the name variations on an individual level and name variations on an institutional level. I always like to use myself as an example, and often I go to Google and I type in MJ Base, and it returns a whole lot of things about Michael Jackson, and all of these things that are unrelated to me. And as much as I'd like to claim credit for Michael Jackson's work, I can't. But if I go and use my ORCID ID and I type that into Google, I get an accurate results list of all my professional activities. And the two reasons that that happens is, one, because Google uses ORCID ID in their algorithm, but two, it shows the power of using a persistent ID. So using a unique ID links things accurately. And that's very important, and this is where persistent identifiers are different from profile systems. So as an example, ResearchGate will send an email to the researcher and say, is this your publication? It's in your field, we know this is your name, but it still has to confirm it's you. A persistent identifier doesn't have to ask that question, because we know when you submitted the manuscript, your ORCID ID was included. So when it comes to linking it to your ID, we don't have to ask if it's yours, because we know it's yours already. And this is where persistent identifiers can really help profile systems in the global community of research to create this. And then importantly, we have institutional variations. I use a very small organization, ORCID, 30 staff members, and only 5 years old, and I can already start listing multiple variations. I don't want to even imagine the complexities of what you have in an organization with 8,000 people, how many different variations of the institution are listed, and how you track that output. So importantly, we use institutional identifiers in the system as well to make that synchronization, and we talk about linking people, places, and things. So commonly, a person identifies an ORCID ID, a place is an organizational identifier, so this could be a Ringgold ID, it could be a grid ID, it could be something from ISNI, it could be any type of organizational identifier. There's a couple that we work with. And then things, we'll use the example of a DOI, a digital object identifier, for an article. And if we have those three identifiers together in metadata, we can create linking across systems. And importantly, what this does is saves time for the individual, because they don't have to manually enter this. Administrators are also happy because they have accurate information in their systems, and they're saving time for their researchers, allowing them to do more research and less time on administration. This is an example that I use. This is an extreme example. I use it in almost every single one of my presentations because it's just simply ridiculous. But what I like about it is it shows that we have a challenge with names. I don't want to go into the details of who did what on this paper. That's another discussion. But it's also, yeah.
It's not real.
No, this is an actual, this is, so I don't want to go into the details of who did what in the contribution. Yeah. So yeah, it's an extreme example, and it's the point that I want to make also importantly is even if we said we only want to search for rank C in this journal and we have the DOI and the paper and all of this information, we would still get 5 variations of this. So names are a problem. We can't use names. We need to use identifiers. But importantly, I want to say is we're not trying to take the identity away from a person. That's very important. It's to enable this metadata, the identifier behind the system. What are we trying to do globally for research management? So there's 2 trends that are happening. One, we want to document the impact of research through these research performance frameworks. So increasingly as a community, we try to understand what is happening in research and what is the impact of this research. But at the same time, we're saying we want to reduce the burden of the individual. So we're saying we want to know more about what's happening, but we're trying to reduce the administration for the individual. But these are cost purpose because the more we want to know about what researchers are doing and the impact, the more we're asking individuals to manually enter information into systems. And this is where ORCID fits very neatly between these 2 goals in that it enables the individual to do less administration work to enable through enabled synchronization, but also allows us as a community to document the impact of research. And we'll go into that in a moment. So ORCID really rests on a simple idea. So as an international research community, working together, we can deliver a huge step forward in openness and reliability of research information. So importantly, making sure that information is open is a core component, and making sure that it's reliable and there's trusted metadata in the infrastructure. So what is ORCID? ORCID is an identifier for researchers. So simply put, it's a 16-digit alphanumeric ID. The ID is owned by the individual, so it's not owned by any institution or any region, and that identifier travels with the individual. If the individual publishes with multiple publishers, they use the same ID. If they move from one institution to the next, they use the same ID. They could even be associated with multiple institutions at the same time. The same ID is used, and that ID will never change and is controlled by the individual. Together, those individuals that have IDs form the ORCID registry. The ORCID registry to date is just over 4.8 million individuals. We continue to grow by about 20,000 individuals every week. For us, this is not really about talking about the numbers, but really to show our commitment as an open organization that we can continue to scale and support the needs of researchers. We then have a set of standard procedures, so APIs, for connecting researchers to their affiliations and activities. So very importantly, as an organization, organizations should be looking to connect to our API. As a researcher, what you should be doing is asking organizations to connect to the ORCID API. And the reason is because the more connections they have, the less work there is for the individual, the more reliable the metadata is. We have a committed community building connections into different systems, and it's an international scale open research effort.
ORCID is an acronym?
Yeah, so Open Researcher Contributor ID. We used to be quite set on trying to tell everyone that, but And we have this thing at ORCID. I've got some new staff joining, and I'm doing a glossary of acronyms that we use at ORCID, and I'm already through a couple of pages. And I was saying to our team last week, we were in San Francisco for our board meeting, saying we need to reduce using acronyms because it's confusing to me, it's confusing to everyone we speak to. But yeah, ORCID stands for Open Researcher Contributor ID. So importantly, that is also important, ORCID is a non-profit organization. We're an open organization. In fact, our entire code base, so if you wanted to copy the code of ORCID, it's open and freely available under CC0 license. So we're not trying to hide anything. We're not trying to build a proprietary system. It's really open and connects to all the systems out there. What I can also say is a question that comes up often, well, what if ORCID was to go and sell our information? So firstly, it's not our information. It's owned by the researcher legally, per the terms of use. It's owned by you. And for ORCID to go and change its registration, so we registered as a non-profit organization. In order to sell the metadata, we'd have to change our registration. In order to do that, we'd require 2/3 majority votes of our board, which importantly, on our boards, 2/3 have to be non-profit organizations, so unlikely that would pass. And then secondly, it would require a 2/3 majority vote across all our members. So every single organization has a vote and is allowed to cast their vote, and that would require 2/3 majority vote. Considering 70% of our members are academic institutions, I would find it highly unlikely that somebody voted that the vote would be that ORCID should become a proprietary organization. That being said, if that happened, the code is open, the public data file is open, somebody could start a non-profit organization exactly as ORCID is today, tomorrow if they'd like to. So that's our ultimate assurance to the community that we are here to serve the greater good of the community. The ORCID community, as I mentioned, is comprised of 876 institutional members. So these are members that contribute financially, which is very important. I don't hide away from that because that is how we remain funded. If we didn't have any membership fees, we wouldn't be a sustainable organization and we wouldn't be able to offer the services that we do. We spread across 43 countries in terms of membership. For individual users, there's users in every single country globally. To date, we have 550 system connections across our members, and we have 4.8 million researchers. We also have 17 consortia around the globe, and these are where a national interests have come together, and they formed a consortium of sorts, Italy being one of the consortia globally. I mentioned ORCID's open. It's an international service that integrates with other research identifiers, and I cannot stress enough, we are not here to compete with any other identifiers. We really are here to create connections. In fact, our API is open, and if one of these identifiers would like to integrate with us, they don't even have to pay us money to integrate. It's free for individuals to use. I spoke about membership being how we're sustainable, and all our data, software, and APIs are open. I'll go into privacy control about the individual in a moment. Okay, so to get into a bit of the context about how the ORCID registry works and how connections to the registry works, this is a good slide. So the individual registers and manages their ORCID ID. You can see over here that the individual controls visibility. So you have an option between private, being the lock, trusted, which is only to systems that you've connected with, and public is public under CC0 license. That setting is per item in your ORCID record, so per work, per email address, etc. in your record that is set. One thing to note is your email address by default will always be set to private unless you change that, because that is sensitive metadata is what we term at ORCID, so that will always be private unless you explicitly make that available to either trusted organizations or to the public. That is up to you as an individual. And then you also set a default privacy setting for the other works in your record but then you can go and change per item in your record. So then what happens is, as an individual, you give permission to other systems to collect your ID, and they can add information to your ORCID record to obviously save time and create a trusted connection. So universities or research institutions can connect an affiliation. You'll notice that when this is done, the source of that information will be from the institution, not yourself. So if you add something yourself to an ORCID record, you'll see the source is your name. If it's added by an organization, the source would be that system. The same happens for funders, the same happens for publishers, and this allows for other institutions to read this metadata, and I'll show you a diagram of that in 2 slides. So what this looks like is, as an example, so university can add information, or research institution can add information. You'll see in this record, ORCID, director membership, it's got the Ringgold ID and the ISNI, and that was provided. So I've got an organizational identifier, there's a grant, and you can see the source of that and the grant URL. And then also publications can be added in the same way, different examples of publications, importantly with the DOI, etc. So how this looks across the community is like this. And what this shows is interoperability across sectors. So enter once and reuse often. So we'll talk through an example. As a researcher, I register for an ORCID ID. It's mine, and I control the visibility in it. And as an individual, I then go to a publisher. So let's use an example. I go to Wiley. Wiley has signed an ORCID open letter to indicate that they will require ORCID IDs for manuscript submissions. So I go to Wiley, and Wiley says, create or connect your ORCID ID to our system. So as an individual, I click that button, and it will ask me for my ORCID username and password, and that will then authenticate with the Wiley system, give them permission, and we'll do these examples in a moment. Once Wiley have, say, passed peer review and sound successful, my publication is going to be published, they will send me a note that it's going to be published, but also what Wiley will do is connect this information back to the individual's ORCID record. So in the record, now I have that article without having to type or add that into the system. Importantly, we can then have our employer connect to our ID as well. So as soon as information is added from Wiley to my individual record, that information can flow into my employer's CRIS or repository system. The same happens with the employer. They can add that. The employer can add information such as the individual's ID. And then when I go to a funder, the funder can connect to my ID. They can track what I've published, where I work, and track that in the funding system. And the funder can also add funding information back to my ID. And this creates interoperability because employers want to understand what researchers are publishing and what funding they're receiving. Publishers are interested in where individuals are affiliated and what funding they're receiving, and vice versa. So it creates this enter once, reuse often, which is really important because it saves the individual time and feeds trusted information between these systems. So importantly, as an individual, what you should be focused on is creating this connection with different systems, and I've got a few examples of that that we'll do live. The publisher open letter, I always like to mention, I think we have to 48 publishers globally that have signed this. These are just a few over here. And the community came together at the end of 2016, the publishing community, and they said, we want to require ORCID IDs in manuscript submission. And this wasn't to create a burden or more work for individuals, but really to enable this flow of information, if we go back a slide, from the publishing system to the researcher's ORCID ID and then into other systems. So it's their commitment. As part of this open letter, they require ORCID IDs for submission, but they also then provide a mechanism to update your ORCID ID with that metadata, so you as an individual don't have to do any of this work. Okay, so briefly I want to skip through some of the benefits for research institutions, and then we'll go into the individual and some live examples. So key benefits, we're going to go through each briefly. So reliable connections, so research organizations can connect to the API and can control how your organization is expressed in systems that your researchers use. So we spoke about name ambiguity. You can update the individual's ORCID record with the correct name, which then enables that ORCID ID to link to other systems such as publisher systems and include that unique organization identifier in that metadata. ORCID provides an international scope. Sorry, the bit faint there, probably should have used a brighter color, but benefit from a global identifier that's broadly used and it's mobile, so it allows you to use this across different systems, across different institutions, across different funders. It allows for pre-population of forms for research institutions, so notifications if an individual publishes a new article and that's added to their ORCID record. Your institutional system can know about this. You avoid delayed reporting, and also we talked about form fatigue. As individuals, this takes a lot of time away from our research in entering information into forms. Alumni updates, so as individuals move around, there was an interesting study done in Science last year that tracked the migration of scientists globally. And this allowed for institutions to gain insights about their former faculty, staff and students. I'll come back to what this means for the individual, because it's not to say that the organization has control over you. You could in fact revoke access from the institution if you wish to do so and hide information from them. But typically researchers aren't, the more discoverable and available your activities are, your professional activities, the more you can be cited. So generally we find that 99% of the metadata in ORCID is made publicly available by individuals. Machines do the work, so this allows for machine-to-machine connections, which we've spoken a lot about, and allows for information to feed across sectors. And also importantly, data with consent. We're not accessing metadata without consent of the individual, and particularly in the context of GDPR, this is even more important. We've been using this slide for probably about 2 years now, and it's something that I think the community is starting to take more note of in light of GDPR, but importantly, you should only be accessing data that you have consent to use from the individual. So it strengthens the trust and confidence in sharing information. And also allowing for automatic updates, so a new publication, new grant, new position. Do you have permission to access that information? Yes, no. If you don't have the permission, you collect the permission and you can read that ORCID record. So that's from a research institution point of view. Looking at individuals, so why should individuals care about ORCID? I generally ask at the start of the presentation, but who has an ORCID ID here? I'm assuming there are most people. Italy is one of the countries that I go to where everyone's like, yeah, we got an ORCID ID. But importantly, I think the challenge is, what is the benefit to me? So that's important for you to realize. So hopefully we'll cover some of that. And we're also talking to different systems in Italy to improve the integrations to make it more beneficial for one, the individual, but also the community as a whole. So researchers, what we did find in a survey that we did last year, that most researchers feel very strongly about ORCID. In fact, 86% or 85.9% of respondents on that survey believe that requiring ORCID IDs is beneficial to the global research community. So not just using ORCID, but requiring it. And this was pleasing for us to see because it was researchers indicating that the more systems that integrate with ORCID, the easier their lives become. The benefit for individuals, and we'll cover a lot of this in the live demonstration, but you have control over your personal data and privacy. That's first and foremost. You have a unique persistent identifier linked to your name that can be used across sectors, across borders, across disciplines. So it doesn't matter what field you're in, what sector, or what region you're in, you can use the same ORCID ID. In fact, one of the best examples that I can use is a researcher in Australia, and it's Andrew Brown, I think. I want to say Andrew Brown, might be David Brown, I keep getting it wrong, but Brown, Professor Brown, is a researcher that does computer code that plays music. So what happens is he sits there and he codes as in software code, and there's a machine on the side and this plays music. So it's quite interesting to watch. There's a few YouTube videos out there. But importantly, he says ORCID is the perfect system for him because he's got YouTube channels, he's got academic articles, he's got blogs, he's got CDs, and he's got all these different types of publications and activities that he's produced, and ORCID allows for this to be connected to one identifier, so really important, and it's a good example. It allows for reduced administrative burden, so allowing systems to synchronize and less work for the individual, and improve discoverability. The more discoverable your work is, the more citable you are as an individual, so that's really important. So what I want to do is go through a few demonstrations. So I'm going to sit for this, and I will just need to check that we
have to share the screen, because now we are sharing just the Acrobat reader. So let's say show this, and if I say this, hopefully, ok. Scusate, vedete lo schermo? Ok, yes, we are sharing the screen.
Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is sign into my ORCID ID. Different keyboards. Where's the apps? Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so I'll sign in over here, and I'm going to sign into my ORCID records. I'm not a well-published researcher, so I may switch to my colleague Laurel Hart, who's the executive director of ORCID. She's a bit better published, but I'll go through a few elements in my record. So we've signed into the record. Importantly, a few aspects that I want to point out in the record is starting off is we have privacy settings per item in the record. So if I don't want my biography to be seen, or if I only want it to be trusted organizations, I can choose that per item. You can always view what the public version is if you click on the left here. You'll see then the different items in your record, so you can add things manually. What will change is education and employment is going to merge into a field called affiliations, because what we want to be able to include is membership to a particular association. So say you're a member of the Society for Neuroscience, as an example. You can then have that membership added to your record. You'll see over here that if I add something myself, so I used to work for a proprietary organization, it was an interesting shift to ORCID, but you'll see that the source of that information is myself. I added that. Over here, you can see the source of this information is ORCID, because ORCID added that information to the system. I don't have to add that information. The same then applies for works, so you can see different works. The source is from DataSite. Standard metadata is included. over here, different contributors, so you can see the different contributors on this and the ORCID IDs on this particular output. Different search engines, different ways to add this, but essentially what I want to point out is ideally you should have very little information that you should add manually yourself. If you're having to add information yourself, it means that those systems haven't built connections into ORCID, and it's something that you should reach out to myself, and my team can go and approach them and say, hey, come on, integrate with ORCID. You don't necessarily need to be a member to integrate with ORCID. So that's important. And then also looking into the account settings. So within your account settings, you can control your notification preference. So if something is updated in your ORCID record, you'll get an email. So that's important. And your visibility preferences. So you'll notice here that this is not a slider. It's now a specific opt-in. As part of GDPR, when you register an ORCID ID, you have to explicitly select your default. As I mentioned, your email address is always private, no matter what, unless you explicitly change that. Even if your default is public, your email address will be private until you change that. So that's important, and you can also set up two-factor authentication as well, and you can download your data from your ORCID record. You'll see here these are trusted organizations, so these are different systems that I've connected to. You can see what access I've provided these organizations, and simply put, if I want to remove access from an organization, as an example, I can simply click revoke access and remove them as a trusted organization. And it's as simple as that to remove the access. So you are in complete control as an individual. We then have trusted individuals as well. So trusted individuals gives them the ability to act on your behalf in your ORCID ID. So this may be an assistant or a colleague that you really trust, but I want to be very clear is you are giving this person permission to act on your behalf in your ORCID ID. So don't just grant this to anyone. Yes.
When you remove the authorization for an asset, if this particular organization puts some records on your ORCID channel, by removing all the rest of those records, will be removed or not?
It doesn't remove the items, so the items are still in the record. You can go change those. But what it does do is remove their permission to access your record. So as an example, if it's a publisher that you've given trusted access and they add a work, and you remove their permission, they can't update that work if something changes in their metadata. So as an example, if maybe there's an error with the title and they update that, they won't be able to do that. So generally, I say to individuals, obviously there may be a reason that you want to revoke that access, but generally speaking, it's the source, it's the publisher, or it's your employer. They can't do anything to manipulate your record. You're still in control who views that. You can delete those items from your record. So it's not to say that they have control over your record. So just think about it if you're going to remove them. But we also do always point it out because we maintain that individual control is a core component of ORCID. So that's essentially the trusted individuals. And then you'll see alternate sign-in accounts here. So I've linked my Google account to sign into ORCID. So one thing that I want to point out, because you can also link your institutional account, so you don't have to remember an extra set of credentials. So if I sign out briefly to link an institutional account, so if you want to use your CNR credentials, so we can click institutional accounts, CNR, and I can go. So what would happen is you would now sign in with your CNR credentials. The next screen would prompt you to put in your ORCID username and password, and that makes a link between those credentials. So then what happens is when you come back in future, when you sign in here, you wouldn't have to. So here it will sign in. Now it will ask you to sign in, so it's got your ORCID credentials. And now we've linked Silvana's institutional credentials to the ORCID credentials. So you'll see over here that the institutional credentials are linked, and it was linked on this date. You can remove this if you want to, but we can leave it here. So, and now what I can show you is if I go to, sorry, log out. So if we go sign in the next time, and now we won't be prompted because we've made that link, it will sign in straight away because we've already signed in with those credentials. So I can make it very simple for you. So if you had a publisher website and you want to sign in with your institutionals, your CNR credentials, you can do so. It's not an extra set of credentials. The one thing that I do want to point out is you may want to, let me sign into my ORCID ID, sorry. So you'll see within my record, there's multiple email addresses. I always recommend to individuals to include multiple email addresses, and the reason is if you want to reset your password and you left an institution, it's a bit difficult to do so. So include multiple email addresses. You'll see here that I've got both my personal and my work email address. They're both set to trusted, so it's not publicly visible. I'm only giving access to the trusted organizations, but I could choose to make those both private if I wanted to. So it's also something to point out is that you would probably want to add multiple email addresses. Okay, so let me go into just quickly a few examples. So one example I like to use is data sites. So I'm going to data site. I've signed into my ORCID account in the other tab. So when I click sign in with ORCID, it's not going to ask me for my username and password because I've already logged in. If you weren't signed in, it would ask you for your username and password. So I click sign in, it signs in, it picks up that I'm at the base, and I've granted them access. If I hadn't granted them access before, it would ask me for access to provide that permission. And importantly, this allows me to create a link. So ORCID auto update, I've enabled this. So if any works go to DataSite and they create a DOI, that work will automatically appear in my ORCID record. So DataSite works in this way. The other big organization that creates DOIs that I recommend accepting permission from is Crossref. What will happen with Crossref is you'll get an email in your ORCID inbox, and Crossref will say, we received an article with your ORCID ID. Do you give us permission to update your record? I recommend that you do that because that allows for any works that Crossref receive with your ORCID ID to be updated in your ORCID record. You don't have to do that work. So that's also important. You can also use this as an example to search, so you can search their information and add records to your ORCID record if you'd like to. You'll see as you go through, some are in my record already, some I can add to the records, so very simple and easy to add works to your record. But ideally, you shouldn't have to do any manual searching because you've created an automatic synchronization. So the auto update, as I showed you in the previous screen, is enabled, and that allows for DataSite to automatically update my record. Another system that I wanted to show you is My Science Work. So I haven't created an account before, so this is a registration link. I want to create and connect my ORCID ID. So just need to enter my email address. There we go. Okay. And it asks me my science work wants to be able to read my record, and I can authorize this. And this is obviously now in their system, so it allows them to import things from my record, and I can say update weekly as an example, submit, and this now links to my my science work. You'll see here, this is the first time I've created this profile in the system, and automatically you can see all of this information was added to my ORCID, to my science work record without me having to do anything. And this is the power of using an identifier, is creating the synchronization. The same can happen with a CRIS system, the same can happen with any system that connects with ORCID. So that's also nice to point out. And the final one that I wanted to show you was Publons. So Publons tracks peer review. So if you're a researcher that does a lot of review work, I would recommend that you register an account with Publons, so your peer review activity can also be added to your ORCID record. This is again, as we were saying, it's not just about publications, but peer review could also be something. So I can authorize Publons to have access to my record. And then once I've done that, I'll be able to link peer review to my ORCID record and display that. So that's really a demonstration of how to connect with systems. We're trying to standardize the experience of connecting your ORCID ID to different systems. So we're working very actively with the community to make sure that that process is clear and simple to researchers, so it's not confusing and not different across all these different systems. The last thing I wanted to show you is just a more complete record, and then I'll finish just talking a bit about some work that we're doing at Funders. This is just an example of Laurel Hart's record, our executive director. So I'm a trusted individual on a record, and you can see Laurel's got 120 works in her record. And I wanted to show you specifically one where there were multiple sources. So ORCID can deduplicate work, so it doesn't display multiple times if it has the same identifier. It's very difficult for us to make an assumption based on the title being the same, because in our world, if it's got different DOIs, it's got different, so it may be a pre-publication version and a published version with the same title. We're not going to merge those because they're not the same. So it will deduplicate based on the same DOI. So I just want to find one. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through here. So here's one. You can see this is a preferred source of 3. You can see that this record has come from 3 sources. One is Elsevier, Scopus, one is from Crossref, and one Laurel added herself. And it doesn't display multiple times, it displays only once, and you as the individual can choose which is your preferred source to send that record. So that's how we deduplicate. And all the details are over here. I also recommend that you do link your ORCID ID with particularly Scopus and Web of Science, because those 2 indexes do a lot of work with metric indicators. So if you want to look at your H index or your impact factor, and they leverage off what's in ORCID. So if you make that link, it makes it easier for them to disambiguate and give you credit for all the work that you've done. Okay, so finishing, I just want to go through just a bit of the work. We've spoken about institutional sign-in, but just a bit about a project that we're working on this year. It's Project Orbit. So Orbit, again, all these acronyms. stands for ORCID, Reducing Burden and Improving Transparency. Very complicated. I don't know why we let's do this, but anyway, ORCID, the project, and really what we're trying to do here is focus on making sure that funders can make use of ORCID in an effective manner. So ORCID was really started out of some work that we were doing with NIH in the US, and really what they wanted to do is make it easier for researchers. So it wasn't about their needs. They wanted to make ORCID and the infrastructure easier for researchers to transmit data or metadata to individuals. A good example of using ORCID in CV systems is if you Google ORCID Science CV integration, there's a YouTube video of what they've done. We are now working with a global community. We are engaging with some of the folks here in Italy to get them involved in the project. So again, I included here to appeal to you if you or any other institutions that you feel would like to get involved in this project, let me know. And we're prioritizing to try and get a global community together to talk about how do we improve the functionality of ORCID in the context of funding information. The focus is on automatically populating funding applications for CV systems, so as an individual, less time. Being able to share grant information, so if you receive a grant from a funder, to have that information added to your ORCID record, and then also extend the availability of this information to make it reusable across the global community. That's it for me. I think I'm on time. But you can find out more from a membership point of view, members.orcid.org is integration, as individuals register. I also recommend looking at orcid.org.help or support.orcid.org as a resource. Again, I welcome you to email me directly. I'm happy to answer any questions or have my team get back to you and also assist. We are glad to learn and engage with the community. We really are not here to, I always say, don't suffer in silence. We're not a proprietary organization where we won't listen to you. If we don't listen to you, we'll not have an organization. So it's important to us to listen to you and your needs. We also do have an ORCID Ideas Forum. If you just Google ORCID Ideas Forum, if you have suggestions for things that we can do with our interface or changes, please recommend them. Our team will get back to you. And we've got a very iterative process to work through those new ideas that come through from the community. So thank you very much. I know we've got time now